Hey guys, it is that time of year where I'm going to be sharing my favorite Christian fiction books that I've read in the last 12 months. I've been doing this since my first year on BookTube, I believe, so there should be a 2020 list, and that was like my favorites pretty much of my life thus far. Then I did one in 2021 sharing my favorites from the last year, same with 2022. Here we are in 2023, and one of these days, again, I will share a list of like favorite Christian fiction, period. But there has been some really good stuff written, and even I've like read some older stuff in the last while, and I feel like it would be a really hard thing for me to pick my absolute favorites. So I want to share my favorites that I've read in the last year. So I'm going to be breaking this up by genre, and the most read genre for me was historical fiction, Christian historical fiction. So we'll do that first, and then we've got some science fiction and some contemporary. And the Christian historical fiction that I enjoy is not what I grew up reading. So I grew up with a small Christian school with a teeny little library, and there was like a lot of Lori Wick and Jeanette Oke and like a lot of like Western kind of historical fiction, or like just very predictable. And I have learned that not every Christian fiction book is like that. I kind of just assumed it was because that's all there was in the library. But it turns out there's some amazing books out there, and also a few amazing authors. There are some authors that are on here multiple times, and I feel like if they're on here multiple times, you're pretty safe to read like most of their books. So let's kick things off. Historical fiction. My first one, actually my first two, are by the same author, and I could have put all three of her books on here, but I was feeling a little maybe redundant. But the first one I'm going to talk about is The Nature of Small Birds. As I was going through my Goodreads, I realized I only started reading Susie Finkbeiner in the last year, and I read all three of her books that I've read during that time, and I've got another one right here on my shelf that is just come out, so I need to read it. Okay, The Nature of Small Birds. This one is, I find, a hard one to explain because it sounds more complicated than it is. First of all, I love this cover. I have become kind of obsessed with watching birds in the last couple years, and it's simple, but I love it. So in this one, we follow three different timelines, and we're following kind of like four family members. So we're following Bruce in, I think it's like 2013. This has been almost a year since I read this. Yeah, 2013. Then we're following Sunny in the 80s at some point, and Sunny is the daughter to Bruce. And then we're following Linda in the 70s, and Linda is the wife to Bruce, the mother to Sunny. So Bruce and Linda have Sunny biologically. And then in 1974, they end up adopting a girl, and her name is Mindy. And oddly, we're not getting the story from Mindy's point of view at all, but I would say she's the main character. So Mindy is adopted from Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and we're in all these different timelines, we're kind of learning about that and her upbringing, and in the 2013 timeline, she's trying to find her biological family. And as an adoptive mother, I loved this book. As someone that often struggles with multiple characters, points of view, timelines, I did not really struggle. They were all so different. I mean, you have the 70s, you have the 80s, and you have the 2013s, and the characters were all so different, but we were like still following the same family. I found it unique. It made me cry. It pulled at all my heartstrings, and I loved it so much. If I had to pick, like, I've rated all three of her books that I've read 5 stars. This would still be my favorite out of all three. Okay, that might not be true. I might have read All Manner of Things a little earlier. That might have ended up on last year's list. I will leave all the lists of my previous Christian fiction favorites in the description below. But another Susie Finkbeiner that's going to end up in here is Stories That Bind Us. And this one is also set right around the same time. This is in the 60s, but our main character, Betty, her husband dies in like the first few chapters, and she becomes a widow at the age of 40. And like, oh, this author, she just tries to like gut wrench me every time. For some reason, Betty's sister ends up coming back into town, and unbeknownst to Betty, she has a son. The sister has a son. So Betty has this nephew, and she spends a lot of time with him throughout the summer. And there are so many things going on in this book, but not like she tried to fit in everything just to hit all the themes or anything like that. It's just in a beautiful way. Like, we all have complicated stories. You know, if I tried to explain my story in 30 seconds, you wouldn't get the gist of it. But if you spend more time with me, you'll realize there's like more layers to it. And I feel like that's how her books are. I'm bad at describing them, but they're very good. A new to me author, I think last year, I'm pretty sure at least one of her books ended up on my list last year, is Joanna Davidson Politano. And I read The Lost Melody. This one came out last fall. And this has to do with an insane asylum. And honestly, like, the book was really good, but I felt myself feeling anxious in it because our main character, her name is Vivienne, and she is a pianist. Her father dies. And so she's in this period of like mourning. What is the time period? I think we're in Victorian. I'm pretty sure she always writes into the Victorian time period. So her father dies, so she needs to be mourning, otherwise it would look really bad. But she, for some reason, wants to go to this insane asylum and kind of work as a maid or something. And something happens and she ends up getting committed, which honestly, isn't that everyone's worst fear? Like, and you can't try to get out of an asylum, because if you tell people you're not crazy, like, the more you kind of like freak out and stuff, like, the more crazy you're gonna seem. And so, like, my heart was like beating through this book because I was just curious to see how she was gonna get out of it. And there's a lot more going on other than that, but hopefully that's enough to hook you. I read a non-Christian book about kind of like the same idea, not the same idea, but also I think it was called, I don't know, Lost Girls of Willowbrook is the book. And Willowbrook School was kind of like an insane asylum as well. Like, there was some similar vibes. They both made me anxious, but this one was written way better in my opinion. Then another author I think I read the first book of last year was Amanda Dykes, and her book Set the Stars Alight. You guys, her writing is very poetic, and I know some people are gonna love that, like me, and some people aren't. And that's fair, but I do love it, so I loved this book. It's dual timeline, and both timelines have to do with this shipwreck that happened probably kind of around the Victorian era. I don't remember the timing now. And so in the modern day timeline, our main character is, I forget what it's called, but she like researches, studies shipwrecks, and she gets permission to dig up this one that she's been interested in from childhood. Or I don't know if it's necessarily dig it up, but like research it, go down, study it. And then we're also like learning about, when we flip back to the old timeline, we're learning about what actually took place. And then like in the kind of modern timeline, we're learning about what they think took place and kind of how they line up and how they, it's fascinating. Wow. Apparently if I haven't read a book for almost a year though, I forget how to talk about it. One that I read recently, and if you can judge from my mini tabs, was definitely a 5-star book, is Things We Didn't Say by Amy Lynn Green. Now, this book is told in letters, and our main character, Johanna, is currently, at the beginning, she's away at university, and we're set in 1944, and she's a linguist. She gets asked to move back to her hometown to work at a German POW camp to censor and translate their letters. And right at the beginning, the first chapter is actually a letter of her written to her lawyer, explaining how she's been falsely accused, and she hopes that her letters, which she's sending him, which is this book, will exonerate her. And it was fascinating. There was so many things that I loved, so many good quotes, so many character development moments. There's just so many great things in this book. I really enjoyed it. Okay, and then this author, I kind of never know how to categorize her books. Like, yes, they are historical fiction, but I think more of the emphasis is kind of like on the mystery side of things. But I have 2 books by Jamie Jo Wright. The one is The Premonition at Wither's Farm, and so her books are always dual timeline, and in this one we're set in like this farmhouse, this couple in the modern day timeline by this farmhouse, and like the basement, the foundation is made out of old tombstones, or like maybe not old, but like maybe they've been like there was like a spelling mistake or something like that. So like not necessarily that they were used for a tombstone, but somebody that made tombstones had made them for some reason and they ended up in this foundation, which just like there's a creep factor right there to begin with. And in the modern day timeline, they're also this woman and her husband are struggling with infertility, and she's very depressed for a lot of the book, and that has a lot to do with it. Definitely some trigger warnings. And then in the past timeline, our main character wants to be a doctor, nurse. She is a self-proclaimed rural healer, and the doctor thinks she's kind of crazy because she uses some very unconventional methods which are not always very helpful. But there is someone that is murdering people around the area, murdering girls and in the corn stalks. And this happens to be like right in the same area where, of course, our current timeline takes place. So they eventually wind up together. And I always love seeing how Jamie Jo Wright weaves her stories together. And then my other book by her, which I don't actually have a physical copy of, I have physical copies of almost all of these books, is The Vanishing at Castle Moreau. And this one is kind of cool because the modern timeline actually takes place in a castle, first of all, which, I mean, I'm in for castles. But our main character, she is going to help this old lady, like who's a hoarder, declutter her house, which is actually a castle. And the old lady doesn't know that this girl's coming to do that. And you know, old lady antics. I'm so there for the old lady antics. Not always so fond of change. And then in the past timeline, this same castle has often, or like was kind of like the scene of a number of disappearances. A lot of young girls disappeared around this castle, and there's a lot of like folklore locally about what goes on there, and of course the timelines interweave. And I feel like she always does such a good job hitting some hard topics that aren't usually discussed or approached in Christian fiction, and I feel like she always does it really well. So pretty much every Jamie Jo Wright is going to end up on these lists eventually. Next we're going to go into science fiction. I actually only have two. One of them, because I loved Frank Peretti in high school. I guess we had some of his books in my school library, but I read Illusion this last year, and I had no idea this book existed until recently, and I loved it so much. So our main characters are Dave and Mandy. So back in the 70s, they were a magic show, and then we actually start out the book, I think they've just been in a car accident, and Mandy has died, and Dane is trying to move on with his life. So he's trying to move on with his life. Meanwhile, Mandy is somehow, this is like science fiction, right? So she's transported into the present time. I think it's like 2010, but as a 19-year-old. So it's like she's somehow skipped 40 years. And yeah, I don't know, it was very interesting. I have loved, I think, pretty much all of Frank Peretti's books, and this one is one of my favorites, along with The Oath, which will forever and always be a favorite of mine. Next was a new to me author, and the book was Recorder. So this is science fiction, actually like set in space, not a time travel kind of science fiction. And here we are in a world where I think it's kind of like it's in the future, I'm pretty sure. And we have this world where there are recorders. They are people who have been raised to be completely unbiased. So they are kind of pretty much go to like an orphanage type thing, but it's very clinical, and you like all their hair is shaved. They have the same outfits. No one has any identity. Everyone is just called Recorder, because if you have a name, then you could be biased apparently. And then at a certain age, you are hooked up to a drone that pretty much just gives you like an electric shock or something if you show any kind of bias or emotion of any sort. And so then once you officially become an actual recorder with a drone, it's your job to go to different places and just record what's going on. Well, our main character, Recorder, has to go with a group of people to a different planet or something, and he's supposed to record what's going on. but something happens and her drone gets wrecked, and they're kind of like out of contact with the people at the consortium, which is where the recorders kind of are based. And she has this opportunity to actually show emotion and bias, and it's interesting to see like the psychological thought process behind like her thinking about this. And I really enjoyed this book. Unfortunately, book 2 was not as high in my opinion, but I still want to read book 3. So that was science fiction. And then my next area is contemporary. One of the books I don't have a physical copy for but have the ebook for is Tarnished Silver. This is set right around Christmas time. It's like leading up to Christmas, and our main character is a bakery owner. Obviously things are really busy around Christmas. She's getting a lot of custom orders and bigger orders, and so she decides to hire a friend, or like kind of like an acquaintance, to clean her house during this season because she can't keep up with everything, long hours and stuff. And one day this person who is cleaning her house comes across something like life-changing. Like, it's a big secret of the bakery owners, and so the maid, as we'll call her because I always forget names of people, she has to like think of what she's gonna do with this information, and maybe doesn't pick the best options right off the bat. But it's really a funny book, but also really deep. And speaking of Shatona, we'll just keep going with 2 more of her books. I've really enjoyed her books. So I'm counting these kind of as one. These are 2 books in a series. There are 2 novellas that lead up to a series, which I haven't started the actual part of the series yet, but I gave both of these 5 stars. So we've got Spines and Leaves and Heart of Noel, and this is also a Christmas book, or like set at Christmas. So in both of these books we have a man named Milton. He takes businesses out of debt, like near bankruptcy, to try to help them revive. And it just so happens that he starts doing this with bookstores, and so this is kind of like his story helping 2 different bookstores. And as someone that just, you know, loves books, you think about how it would be kind of cool to own a bookstore. I don't think I'd actually want to be around people all day, but being surrounded by books would be pretty cool. And I have really enjoyed these. It really bothers me that I have not actually continued the series because I really love these, so I need to do that. And then the last book is The Extraordinary Deaths of Mrs. Kipp. And this is a book that I just like did not understand the title of going into it, and now after reading it, it's like, oh, it all makes sense. So Mrs. Kipp has been diagnosed with cancer. She has very little time to live. She's going into hospice care, and this girl named Aiden is assigned to write her obituary, or so Aiden thinks. Aiden's boss is actually kind of like manipulating things here. There's a little bit more to it than that. But Aiden and Mrs. Kipp kind of come to an agreement. Mrs. Kipp will tell her a little bit about her life so that Aiden can write this obituary. Mrs. Kipp will answer 3 questions, I think it is, every time Aiden comes up with like an extraordinary death for her. But what Aiden doesn't realize is that Mrs. Kipp is not just like your typical run-of-the-mill old lady. She had an incredible backstory, history. Once again, like, people are so much deeper than you often can tell from the outset. And I love Mrs. Kipp's personality, her encouragement. Like, she's going around this little nursing home and sitting with people as they're dying, and it's something to aspire to, both for when I'm an old lady and also now in my life. So there you have it. Those are my favorite Christian fiction books that I've read in the last year. And these, I think, were actually all 5 stars. Sometimes when I go back through my Goodreads, a 4-star book will really jump out at me and I'm like, I need to include that. And sometimes a 5-star book won't get included, but maybe I'm getting better at rating things on Goodreads. These were 5-star books, are still 5-star books. I would love for you to read each and every one. Let me know if you have a favorite from here, and or if there's a book that you're interested in reading now. I hope you really do. So thanks for being here, guys.